Hey guys, Rhett Thompson here, and today we are looking at my ideal 3-lens setup. So as you probably know, I'm doing weddings, events, corporate videos, talking head, interview type stuff most of the time. And so these lenses are gonna be looked at as a set when it comes to that type of work. If you're doing narrative filmmaking or photography, this might not mean anything to you, but it also could be, I don't know, potentially viable. So to me, a lens set is something that can cover a range for you. You know, you've got a standard in the middle, sort of like your 24 to 70-ish range. You've got a telephoto version for stuff that happens to be further away, and you've got a wide angle lens to cover that, you know, real estate, wide angle, establishing shot, whatever. But in general, for most people, I think that standard zoom is gonna be your go-to for most things, at least when you're starting out. And my standard lens of choice today is, you probably guessed it if you are familiar, the Leica 10-25. I cannot stop talking about this thing. It is so amazing for video creators and content creators, like even YouTubers. I'm using it right now, and it's a great, fairly wide angle, fairly fast lens. For my type of work though, the biggest benefit is just the focal range and aperture combination in general. You start at a 20mm equivalent wide angle and go into a 50mm equivalent, which is like this standard length focal lens. So long story short, this is wide enough to cover most of my wide angle work and can zoom in, we'll do it right now, you can zoom into a relatively pleasing looking sort of headshot, talking head interview style focal length with a nice bit of blurry background. And so I can generally do most of my talking head stuff just with this one lens, getting both a sort of environmental sort of waist up full body shot and then the close up style, you know, just the head, shoulders up sort of shot, just in one lens. There's tons of other features too, weather sealing for any condition, par focal zoom, good autofocus for the GH5. I know it's not saying much. In general, it's just got a ton of features for videographers, and I really love it for that standard range. And even though there's 3 lenses in this set, this thing probably covers like 75, 80, 90% of the stuff I do for paid work. The next lens is another lens I've done a couple videos on, and that is the Olympus 40-150. It is a great lens. It's got an f2.8 aperture all through the range. It's got a manual focus clutch just like the 10-25. And it's got a really great range as well, going from like an 80 to 300mm equivalent. So it's not quite your 70 to 200 because it starts at 80 instead of 70, but it also goes past your 200 onto 300mm on the GH5 with the full frame equivalent. And that's gonna be great for events, plays, weddings, things like that. It's gonna provide you with a fast aperture and a great range with all of the features, more or less, that the 10-25 has. Sure, it's not the perfect lens, and I would really love a big brother to the Leica 10-25 dedicated, like a 1.7 zoom lens, but until that lens comes along, the Olympus is the next best thing. In fact, I've got an entire video talking about the Olympus in comparison to the other professional zooms for the Micro Four Thirds system, that being the Lumix 35-100 and the Leica 50-200, and why I think the Olympus was the lens for me. That's a separate video too. So the Olympus just ended up being the telephoto lens of choice for me. Although Panasonic, please make us that f1.7 zoom. It would be so awesome. Think about it, 35 to 70. Ooh. We've got an honorable mention here too, by the way. Sometimes for certain jobs, I will, instead of taking the 40-150, or in addition to the 40-150, I will take the Panasonic Leica 42.5 f1.2. It's a beautiful lens. It's pretty small for what it is, and sometimes the extra light gathering and blurry background of that lens beats out the flexibility of the zoom of the Olympus 40-150 for me, especially when you get to like the reception of a wedding, for example. And so in those situations, a fast aperture prime might be a better choice than a telephoto lens based on that particular job or your particular needs. Still, I would say I take the Olympus probably twice as much to paid shoots over the Leica. So, and I also could easily live without the Leica and just use the 40-150 for everything. So is it nice to have? Yes, but I don't consider it essential. And the last lens, that super wide angle lens sort of focal length, is the Laowa 7.5 millimeters, the only prime in this list. This is sort of a specialty lens, even more than usual, just because the Leica 10-25 is already at 10 millimeters, but the Laowa being at 7.5 millimeters is just that extra bit wider. It actually makes a pretty huge difference. Here is the Laowa 7.5 millimeter f2. As you can see, is this my TV? Yeah, it's a lot wider. It's kind of ridiculous. And we're back on the Leica here, but yeah, you can see that lens would be great for establishing shots, gimbal work. I've used it a lot for real estate. It does have a tiniest bit of distortion, but you can either correct it or, if you're like me, just not care. And yeah, it's a great tiny little lens, and I prefer it over something like an 8-18 or maybe the Olympus 7-14, which might be slightly better quality, slightly match these other lenses better. But for me, I use that ultra wide angle field of view so infrequently that a lens that small, that was actually a huge benefit for me, just because the Leica 10-25 is so huge. The Olympus 40-150 is also giant, and so having this tiny little lens for me, just for those 2 or 3 shots every job that are gonna need that, or at least I'm gonna want that really wide perspective on, having such a tiny lens and it being so fast as to be somewhere in between the 1.7 of the Leica and the 2.8 of the Olympus, it just is really handy, and I don't really miss the autofocus that much or the other electronic features just because it is so wide, it's kind of hard to mess up your focus that bad. And so yeah, hopefully those 3 lenses give you a pretty good idea of what a lens set would look like. The biggest drawback of this lens set for me is that they don't exactly match 100%. You know, the Leica has really neutral colors, the Olympus have that sort of warm look to it, and the Laowa is kind of doing its own thing, being not 100% neutral, but not as warm as the Olympus either, and having some, you know, not as great colors. Like, I think it's got a little bit of magenta in there, which isn't always what you want. And so yeah, if there was a, I'm gonna say it again, if there was a Leica 35-70 or 40-80 or some telephoto f1.7 Leica zoom, I would sell that Olympus tomorrow to pre-order it. But until that happens, this is the best you're gonna do with these lenses. If you really care about lens sets matching, you could obviously go for something like the Olympus 12-40 and the 40-150. They've also got a wide angle 7-14 too. So then you'd have that 7 to 150 millimeter range, all at f2.8, all matching characteristics, and that would be beautiful. And I do value that a lot for narrative filmmaking, but for things like weddings and things like corporate videography, I'm less worried about the look of it per se when it comes to lens characteristics, and more worried about how they actually are to use and how they actually function. And so this was just the best 3 lens setup I could find. Obviously, if this Leica 10-25 is out of your budget, you could use something like the Olympus we talked about or the Lumix 12-35. I have my issues with those lenses, but they are still great options. Just keep in mind having that range of a standard, a telephoto, and a wide angle lens for every situation you would run into. After you get those, I feel like you can consider lenses like with faster apertures or things like that for those really specialty cases, macro lenses, things like that. But until you get that standard telephoto and wide angle range covered, I think if you don't have one of those, it's gonna hold you back and you're gonna find yourself in some sticky situations based on just lack of coverage, especially for like events and weddings. So anyway, guys, I hope that was interesting to you to see my 3 lens setup for the GH5, my most used lenses. And if it didn't particularly help you pick out exactly these 3 lenses for your set, at least those principles of why I chose these lenses can help you pick a set of standard telephoto and wide angle lenses for your own videography. Anyway, if you learned something or found this video interesting, I would definitely go down, like the video. While you're down there, I would love to hear a comment. What is your sort of go-to lens setup for your jobs? Like, what are those 3 lenses or so that you're taking with you on like every job, using most often? And what about them makes you want to use them? And also maybe what is missing with them? And maybe I can help you find a viable upgrade path to see what might be the next lens for you, which could unlock some potential for you. You don't have to get super expensive lenses. There's tons of cheap telephoto and wide angle lenses that I recommend you get first to get comfortable with the focal lengths before you pull the trigger on something as expensive as the Leica 10 to 25. Also, I'm a pretty new channel. I'm really trying to grow my subscriber base, so if you liked this style of video and want to see more, please also consider hitting that subscribe button to get notified when my new videos go live. Thanks for stopping by, guys, and if you hit subscribe, I will see you in the next video.